Good morning and welcome to the June 2016 live Q&A call for the aEEG Coach Program. And this is Kathy Randall, and just wanted to say a quick welcome to everyone. And I am super excited to share with you that I just got back day before yesterday from an amazing trip to Brazil, where I was invited by Dr. Gabriel Veriani, one of our fellow aEEG Coach community members, who is a neonatologist at Santa Joana Medical Center in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And he has been an amazing advocate of aEEG throughout Brazil and had organized a workshop for 60 neonatologists and nurses, and just did a great, amazing job coordinating this workshop. And then I had the chance to participate with some of the attendees and get to know them. And another exciting thing we got to do was to actually tour the NICUs where he is practicing. So on the left-hand side, you can see some of the team at the hospital in Sao Paulo, where they have a 150-bed NICU, and their NICU is divided into 4 different areas, and they have one area that is specifically a Neuro-NICU, and you can see on the right there is a picture of their warming bed there with their cooling mattress ready to go and aEEG at the ready. And they also are partners with another hospital, which you see down on the bottom right, which is a 70-bed NICU in the same town. And then on the lower left, you can see the delivery area. So in order to have a 150-bed NICU, you have to have a pretty big delivery system, our delivery service, and they deliver about 60 babies a day. So this is the actual transition nursery. You see one of the nurses there attending to 3 babies who had just been delivered. It was quite an amazing experience to see all of the care and the system, and really to just be exposed to another place that's doing amazing neurological care for babies. Of course, the trip to Brazil wouldn't have been complete without some trips to the beaches and some of the sites of Brazil. So I just wanted to throw in a few of those, as well as I got the opportunity to visit the mega store for the Olympics. So anyways, it had just opened up, and of course the Olympics will be there in about a month, actually a month from today. So anyways, so I detoured just to kind of share a little bit of our aEEG coaching community and what is happening around the world, and kind of how exciting it is to be a part of this small yet growing important field of neonatology. So diving into the content for today, I thought we would just review a little bit about the normals and abnormal patterns. And I want to put this in context of what is expected and what is not expected. So of course we know there are 5 common patterns for aEEG. We have one normal for the term baby, we have one normal for the preterm baby, and then pretty much everything else is considered abnormal regardless of your age. And we're all familiar with the different classification techniques that we can use. So we have a pattern description, and then we have a voltage-based description. And so we have the names that we've all become accustomed to: continuous normal voltage, discontinuous normal voltage, burst suppression, continuous low voltage, and inactive. And each of these criteria have their own specific criteria for the margins. Sorry, that lower margins got kind of goofed up there. So for our normal pattern, we're always looking for the lower margin to be above 5 and our upper margin to be above 10. So then we know that we have other variations of moderately abnormal and severely abnormal depending on those voltage limits. So important to kind of decide in your unit which classification pattern you're going to use, and it depends a little bit on kind of the experience of your team. So let's talk then about what is normal and expected for that healthy term baby. So for that healthy term baby, we're expecting them to have a continuous normal voltage pattern we would want to be looking at this on the single channel cross-cerebral P3, P4 view on your device, and looking for the upper margin to be greater than 10, the lower margin to be greater than 5. And of course, for a healthy term baby, we would also be expecting while asleep to see some alternating patterns between the continuous and discontinuous pattern lasting for about 30 to 40 minutes, kind of moving through that sleep-wake cycle. So definitely want to be seeing that for our healthy term babies. The discontinuous normal voltage pattern might be seen in a healthy baby who has maybe received sedation for some sort of procedure. Maybe you might see it in a baby who's maybe a late preterm. You thought their term, but they're kind of a later preterm kiddo. And of course, the others are never, ever normal. So it's really important then when we're talking about the normal voltage patterns and when we expect them and when we don't expect them, to keep in mind the infant's history. And of course, we talk about this a lot in module number 2. But just as a review, there are many things that can impact the aEEG background pattern. So the infant's age, whether that's gestational age or post-conceptual age or actual chronological age, those things matter. Their history, whether or not they're receiving cooling, and whether or not they've received medications. All of these things are going to have an impact on the pattern. So for today's Q&A call, I'm just going to focus on aEEG or the aEEGs for age and cooling as just kind of those. What do you expect when you have kiddos who are younger than term, and then the babies who are undergoing cooling, and what can it really tell us over time? So again, to just focus in a little bit on the different background patterns that are expected. So again, you're going to have these kids who you're going to monitor, and then, what do you expect to see? So I think it's so important to kind of have that in the back of your mind, what is expected. So of course, for a baby who has little or no injury related to HIE or encephalopathy, you're really going to expect those kids to have a normal voltage trait. So that's going to be upper margins greater than 10, lower margins greater than 5. When they have a mild injury, you are very likely to see a discontinuous normal voltage pattern where that lower margin drifts down below 5. Oftentimes you lose some of their cycling or their kind of mature cycling. And then of course, when we have a baby who has severe injury, sorry for a typo there, severe injury, especially if that pattern persists, we know that that's more indicative of a really severe injury as well as severe pattern, which is going to result in a poor outcome. Low voltage trace, usually indicative of a very severe hypoxic hit. The mild injury kids can kind of flirt on the edge between discontinuous and burst suppression. And if it's transient and short-lived, that can be a very, if they recover quickly, and we're going to talk about that here in a second. So gestational age, this is going to be our other, sorry, there's another typo on here, another set of kiddos that we want to look at. So of course, for kiddos greater than 35 weeks, we want to see them to have a normal voltage pattern. So we want to see that lower margin really lift above 5 for the majority of the time. Discontinuous, you can pretty much see from very extremely preterm all the way up until they kind of hit that 32, 34, 35 week period. So those kind of mid to late 30 weeks. Burst suppression, although it's not really burst suppression, but it looks a lot like burst suppression, is really common in those extremely preterm kids. So we'll show some examples of that as well. So let's talk again about these cooling babies. So if we are looking, let's just do a review, I guess, before we talk about the cooling kids. So if we talk about using voltage classification, and we say that in order for a pattern to be called normal, and this is really the pattern descriptions that were created by al-Nakib. So if you've looked back in the literature, you oftentimes see this al-Nakib voltage classification. The only normal trace, according to al-Nakib, was upper margins greater than 10, lower margins greater than 5. If you had, and this is for term babies with HIE, so if we had that was a normal definition. If you had the upper margin greater than 10, but the lower margin greater than 5, he considered these moderately abnormal. So this included the discontinuous and the burst suppression patterns. And then to get to severely abnormal, the upper margin had to be less than 10, and then of course the lower margin less than 5. So then if we go instead and look in the literature for what is considered normal versus abnormal, just straight up normal, abnormal, no kind of middle ground there, we see the use of pattern recognition. So for the studies that talked about HIE kids, they used normal as both continuous and discontinuous. These were the patterns that they saw, that the kids who had these kinds of patterns, especially in the first 3 to 6 hours, they knew that these kids, that was predictive of a good long-term outcome. The kids who showed burst suppression, low voltage, and flat tracing, they consider these abnormal, although we know if they are short-lived and convert, we know these kids have better outcomes. But for just the first 3 to 6 hours, we wanted to say that an abnormal pattern that was predictive of bad outcomes were the burst suppression, low voltage, and flat tracing. So you can see that these two different classifications, they use a lot of the same words and the same names for the patterns, but what they meant to the early researchers were a little bit different things. So again, the voltage classification, just using straight voltage, upper margin had to be greater than 5, lower margin had to be greater than 10. For a moderately abnormal, it was that discontinuous and that burst suppression, and then severely abnormal were those really severe traces. And then again, for pattern recognition, we were able to include those kids who had a continuous or discontinuous, knowing that these were kind of more mild cases, especially the discontinuous ones, and that those kids would be more likely to recover fully. So this is published and discussed in Mariana Thornson's paper in July of 2010. So let's talk a little bit of where this kind of came from. So they were using these classification patterns. They were using pattern recognition, and they were looking to see kiddos between the ages of 3 hours and 6 hours who would have a good outcome. And what they found was that those kids who had good patterns in the beginning tended to have good outcomes. Those kids who had poor patterns had poor outcomes. If you look at the box on the left, these are the kids with normal outcomes, and you can see that the majority of them had either continuous normal voltage or discontinuous patterns, and they either continued this way even through the first 6 hours. This was then predictive at 18 months of a good outcome. The kids who that are on below the line, there were 8 of those kids who had burst suppression. They continued to have burst suppression, 5 of them even at 6 hours, 3 of them improved within the first 3 hours of life, and these kids went on to have a good outcome. Now remember, in 1999, when this was published, this is way before the cooling era. So this is where we used to talk about the early predictive value of aEEG and how strong it was. This is why aEEG was used in some of the early cooling studies. If we look on the right side, we see kiddos who had poor outcomes. And especially when we were trying to figure out for cooling, it was really important to know which kids we thought might benefit from cooling the most. And so we wanted to see those kids who had early aEEGs that were very poor, and they wanted to see if they would improve over time. So you can see that the kids who had a poor outcome, there were only 4 of them who started out with a normal voltage pattern, and there was one that had discontinuous, and even within the first 6 hours, went down to a birth suppression pattern. 4 of the continuously normal kids stayed normal at 3 hours. We don't know what are at 6 hours, but we don't know what happened at 12 hours, 18 hours, 24 hours. Again, these kids were not cooled. These kids could have seized and had other things going on, within that first 24 hours as well. You look below the line where we have birth suppression, low voltage, and flat tracing. You can see that the majority of the kids who had poor outcomes are down here in this area. 21 with birth suppression, 6 with low voltage, and 1 with flat tracing. And all of these kids never had an improvement in their pattern in these first 6 hours. So again, this is just giving a little history on why aEEG was originally thought and continues to be thought to be an extremely strong predictor of long-term outcome in the first few hours of life in kids who are not cooled. So again, it could be something that you use to help you decide who to cool. So I love this paper that was published in 2004, and it's a really busy slide, so I'm going to talk you through it. But again, this is just, trying to give you a little of the history of aEEG in cooling babies or babies with HIE, and then how are we going to now manage these expectations of what we expect to see when we're cooling a baby and using aEEG. So let's just look at the top half where you see, so there's the patient numbers are on the left-hand margin. You see the time from birth on the lower axis, so 0 to 72 hours. Then on the right side, you see their outcomes, abnormal outcomes or death, and then we see mildly abnormal and then normal outcomes. So let's just look at the key on the right-hand side and just kind of orient ourselves to this. So if we start with the worst patterns, that would be a flat tracing, that's a red. Then we go to the continuously low voltage, another severe pattern, that's orange. Birth suppression, yellow. Then we have discontinuous pattern, that's the green. And we see the blue is normal voltage continuous. The purple is a normal tracing with sleep. Any place that you see the checkerboarding or the plaid, that's a pattern that was also superimposed with seizure activity. So then now now that you kind of understand the key, let's look at the kids who have the abnormal outcomes. So this is one of the first studies that really looked at the long-term kind of patterns of kids who had HIE and looked at them for 72 hours. And so what they wanted to see were if the first 3 to 6 hours was predictive, was it still predictive at 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours? And so this was the first study that really looked at aEEG over the long term. Again, I would point out this is published in 2004. This was before cooling. But again, important to know the history. So let's look at these kids who have abnormal outcomes and the babies who died. So at the top we see, first thing you notice, at least I noticed, is that every single patient in this category, the majority of their patterns are in that kind of orange, red, and yellow. So we see a lot of flat tracings, we see a lot of low voltage, and we see a lot of burst suppression. You also see a lot of checkerboards, meaning that you've got some kids who are having some seizures. So we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 of these kids in this top section. I think there's only 10 or 11 there. So 9 of them are having seizures. This is why seizures are such a predictive, an important predictor when we worry about kids with HIE. So we do see one little spot of green, and so we see this one kid who is in that section of abnormals. We see that they started out as burst suppression, went to a flat trace, went back to continuous low voltage, transitioned back to burst suppression, went to a discontinuous pattern, and then went to a normal pattern. This baby still had an abnormal outcome. in the first 24 hours of life, this baby was still in a very severe pattern. And after 24, transitioned back to a normal pattern, but the first 24 was very severe. All the rest of these kids that are in the abnormal section all had very bad traces, and they all stayed very bad all the way up through 72 hours. So then now let's transition and look at the kids who had the normal outcomes. So these are the kids starting at the break in this graph where it starts at 28 and goes down to 3. So the thing that I noticed right away is that these kids all have a lot of blues and greens in their pattern. So the blues and the greens were all the discontinuous and the continuous patterns, which we now know were predictive of good outcomes and for 3 to 6 hours. But let's see these kids also had patterns that persisted as pretty normal all the way up through that 72 hours. We don't see any of these kids with the normal outcomes having seizures. We do see 3 or 4 of them who started out with the orange, the yellows, or the reds, but by 12 hours and all of them by 24 hours had transitioned back to either a discontinuous or to a continuous pattern. And so we see kind of, again, that predictive value of the aEEG in those early hours of life. The kids in the middle, they have mild outcomes and mildly abnormal outcomes. You can see that their patterns are a little mixed. Some of them were pretty normal from the beginning. Some of them were normal but had seizures. Some of them had a more of an abnormal pattern that persisted for a little bit longer, crossed over that 24-hour window. We still see some yellow on a couple of these kids at that 24-hour mark. So what this study concluded was that kids who had a normal pattern or converted to normal pattern by 24 hours of life and who were not cooled, they had the best outcomes, and it was predictive of their outcomes. So again, gave some history here, but now that we're cooling babies, what do we do? So Mariana Thorenson has looked, and her group, again, they have looked at whether or not using the pattern classification, so just pattern recognition or voltage classification, can help us to predict which kids are going to have good outcomes now that we are cooling. So they wanted to look at those patterns again in that 3 to 6 hour range and then look at outcomes. So in this particular graph, what they're doing is they're looking at the kids who were cooled. They are the blue, designated as blue, and the kids who were normothermic. So they were comparing kids who were not cooled and kids who were cooled. And what we see is, again, the kids who had a normal outcome are a shape that is not filled in. So we look for the normal outcomes are any of the circles or the triangles that are not filled in. So again, this is still looking at kids between 3 and 6 hours of age, and then looking at their outcomes at 18 months. So again, trying to say, even with kids who are cooled, can we predict outcomes? So if you look in the first area there, we can see the first box. You see the hypothermic kids are the blue kids, and you can see if they had a normal voltage pattern. There's a pretty good cluster of those kids who had a normal pattern and who had normal outcomes. You also see in that same area that the normothermic babies, so babies who did not receive cooling, if they had a normal voltage pattern, they were more likely to have a normal outcome. Then we move to the second column, the discontinuous pattern. So if they had a discontinuous pattern, we see again a fair amount of kids who had discontinuous patterns. All of the hypothermic kids who had discontinuous patterns, they had a normal outcome. Where we start to see the difference is the normothermic babies. So with normothermic babies, yes, some of them did have normal outcomes. You see the open circle, but we also see that kids who were in this pattern but didn't receive cooling ended up with a disability. Now we move to the next column, the burst suppression. So remember that this was that that this is where the patterns begin to diverge, and we consider burst suppression to be moderately abnormal if we just do by voltage, but we consider it severely abnormal if we go by pattern. And so here we see that this is where we start to see a mix, and that kids in the normal thermic group, so the blue triangles, we see that if they had a burst suppression pattern in their first 3 to 6 hours, they could still have a normal outcome. So again, the early aEEG, not as predictive now that we're cooling babies, because we have some kids who have burst suppression who actually turn out to be okay. But we also see that some of these kids who had burst suppression, we had 5 of them who still had a disability. And then we now see 3 who received cooling, who had a burst suppression pattern, who passed away, who died. Then we see for the normal thermic group, we still see a few of those kids who are going to recover. We see a few of those kids are going to die, and then we're going to see a few of those kids are going to have bad outcomes. And these are really those kids where, these discontinuous, these red circles with the filled-in circles, these are the kids who really benefit from cooling, and these are the kids who we want to see receive cooling. So using aEEG to help figure out who these kids are was really helpful for the studies. And then you can continue on, and you can see that the kids who had severe patterns, even early severe patterns, went on to only 2 of them actually ended up having normal outcomes. Those were the ones that were in the cooling groups, and then a couple of them had poor outcomes. And again, these are early 3 to 6 hours, and we know it's not as predictive anymore. Using aEEG is not as predictive now that we're cooling kids. We have to wait longer for their tracing to return to normal. 3 to 6 hours is not going to tell us the whole story. Anne Massaro and her group at Children's in DC, they actually went through and looked at recovery of background as well, and they found that the babies who had no recovery tended, especially by 48 hours, they showed that those were the babies that were more at risk for adverse outcome or death versus the babies who had full recovery. You can see that those babies by 48 hours, if they had full recovery, had no issues and no adverse outcomes. The gray bar, where you see improvement without normalization, again, these are those kids that improve their tracing, but it doesn't normalize even to a discontinuous pattern by 48 hours. These kids are a split. You see 50% have a bad outcome and 50% have a good outcome. So you can't use aEEG. Kids who don't normalize by 48, we really can't be that predictive anymore. All right, so just as a quick review, for cooled term infants in those first 48 hours, what we're hoping to see is those continuous normal patterns, and those discontinuous patterns are acceptable. So we do want to see an improvement back towards discontinuous, or at least, or hopefully continuous. And anything other than that, we know that burst suppression can persist and that those kids can convert, especially the cooled babies. But by 48 hours, we really we want to have a lot of kind of caution about what we think about those kids. And of course, a persistent low voltage or flat tracing is predictive of bad outcome, regardless of cooling treatment. The final group I want to talk about really quickly is our preterm kiddos. So what do we expect for preterm babies? What do we expect their pattern to look like? So there have been several great papers. This is my all-time favorite example. It's the same baby who was monitored multiple times. So I just love that they show this. And this is, again, a healthy baby without IVH, without seizures, a healthy progression of a preterm brain starting around 27, 28 weeks on the left side at letter A, then progressing down towards 29 and 30 weeks on A, B, and C. And then going on the right-hand side, we see 31 weeks, 33 weeks, 35, and 37. And the features that we're looking for, what we expect for a baby under 35 weeks is for their pattern to be still discontinuous. So we expect always the upper margin to be above 10. Again, we're using the C3 or the P3, P4 cross cerebral or biparietal channel for assessing background patterns, especially on preterm. So we want to use this biparietal, and we want to look at the upper margin always being greater than 10. The lower margin we expect to drift below 5, but we expect variability. We do not expect a lower margin that is flat, completely flat. We expect there to be some variability in the low margin, which is reflective of a variable low voltage margin there. So we definitely want that. And then you can see around 31 weeks, we begin to see the emergence of some cycling. 33 weeks, we definitely see, some periods where there is some quiet sleep, where the pattern's beginning to become more continuous. And then we have the sleep, the deeper sleep, or the quiet sleep that is giving us that deep, thick band for 20, 30 minutes. And then by 35 weeks, we see a really robust 30, 40-minute quiet sleep. You see an awake or a sleep period, and then again, a reemergence of a deep sleep cycle. And of course, by 37, we're really seeing these really nice, mature, continuous patterns, very thin, narrow band, and then the thin, thick sleep-wake pattern. So definitely expect to see a change over time. Definitely expect there to be a very thick band showing a very discontinuous pattern for the very premature babies. But as the babies get closer to term, we expect them to be having a more normal tracing. So for those healthy preterm babies, we're expecting to have that continuous normal pattern once they reach 35 weeks. And then, of course, discontinuous pattern with variability at the baseline. We expect that. For even our very, very young 24, 25, 26 weekers, we expect a discontinuous pattern. Burst suppression, you may see it look a little like burst suppression, but we should never see that low, flat margin for even, a very young baby. Low voltage, flat, still never normal, regardless of age, and we always want their upper margins to be over 10. We just always want that. And for preterm babies, you almost always have that big, thick, wide pattern. Anytime you see narrow, anytime you see flat, you want to start thinking about electrode placement, and then you want to start looking for other reasons for suppression. So, so this wraps up our kind of quick review call for the month, and just talking about, again, what is expected versus what is unexpected. So hope you're all having a great July, and I will talk to you again on July 25th. Thanks so much.